Hello and welcome to the Sustainability Skillset Podcast, a show where we explore careers in sustainability and the skills to help you succeed. I'm glad you're here. If you are passionate about sustainability and hungry to learn, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Louis Damaso, a sustainability consultant and young sustainability professional, learning right along with you. Today's guest is Dr. Mike Shriberg, a professor of practice and engagement at the University of Michigan's School for Environment and Sustainability, and the director of the University of Michigan Water Center. Mike has spent his career at the intersection of academia, advocacy, and leadership development, working to prepare the next generation of sustainability professionals for real-world challenges they will face. Mike's work is grounded in a simple but powerful insight. Sustainability leadership is modern leadership. Our field is constantly changing, uncertain, and complex, which means success depends less on memorizing content and more on developing the process skills that help us adapt, collaborate, and lead. In this episode, we dig into Mike's research on how well higher education is preparing students for sustainability careers. We talk about the gap between theory and practice, why project-based reflective learning is so critical, and how universities can better partner with organizations to give students meaningful real-world experience. Mike also shares what he's learned about how skills shift across a career, why the most successful professionals are self-reflective, and how they stand out in interviews, showing not just what they know, but how they think. If you've ever wondered what sustainability leadership really means and how to prepare yourself for a career in this dynamic field, or how higher education can evolve to meet the needs of the moment, this conversation is full of insight. Let's dive in. Good morning, Mike. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Could you start by giving us just a quick overview of your role and what you're working on?
Sure. I'm Mike Shriberg. I'm a professor of practice and engagement at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, and I'm the director of the University of Michigan Water Center. And a lot of my work focuses around sustainability leadership and basically how we can do better in training future sustainability leaders.
That sounds super interesting and super relevant to those listening as well. Could you help us understand a little bit more about what you've recently been looking into and any findings that you're able to share?
Yeah, sure. So this is part of kind of a long-running series of studies with my colleague, Lindsay McDonald. And the basic premise is we're trying to align sustainability leadership training in higher education with the needs in the field. I mean, so what happens a lot is that academic programs are built around kind of the theoretical literature on environmental education, or they're built around a set of kind of theoretical competencies, but maybe less grounded in what's needed to be successful on the ground in our extraordinarily dynamic field. And so what we've been doing is a series of surveys and interviews with graduates of sustainability leadership programs, primarily in the U.S. and Canada, but we've done some international work. This latest one is U.S. focused, and asking them basically, what was your training like? And how does that apply to what you actually need to be successful in the field? So that's kind of what our latest work has been focused on.
Yeah, it is such a dynamic field. And the fact that you're looking directly into and reaching out to recent grads to understand their experience is huge in understanding whether they were prepared by their degrees or not, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because, people, among other things, they put a lot of energy, time, money, et cetera, into these programs. And so we're trying to work to make sure that what they get out of them is effective for what they need in their jobs. And, it's interesting. I don't know if I can jump into some of the findings if it would be limited. So it's interesting. The good news is that people really like the sustainability leadership training programs that they're in. So people rate them highly. People are generally satisfied with the academic side of things and the experience overall. They find it dynamic. People are doing well in the programs are doing well in terms of interdisciplinary training, and people give high marks to the programs overall. The bad news is they're not as good at job preparation as probably they should be. And that is, in large part, I would say, and as a faculty member, I think I'm maybe throwing a little shade at myself in this, but it's because you've got a set of faculty who are largely based in the higher education world for their careers, and then training people for professional development out in the field, writ large. And as you know, our field is really diverse in terms of what sectors people go into, what skills they need, and all those things. So you find that mismatch kind of plays out in terms of when people look back at their experiences. They usually say it was very interesting. I learned some amazing things, but I'm not sure I got the job preparation and specifically the leadership competencies that are most needed in our field.
Yeah, when you say leadership competencies, could you describe a little bit more about what the gap is between what the theory or what theory is being taught and then what's actually needed in job roles?
Yeah, well, so I'm sort of cut right to the chase on that because the top things that people need, and this will be no surprise to you and probably to many of your listeners, is skills in collaboration and teamwork. So when we talk about competencies, it's that blend of sort of knowledge and skills and aptitudes and things that sort of like can be helpful. And so the top three things that people said that they needed in the field to advance is collaboration and teamwork skills, skills in communication, and then the third was maybe the one that they're getting the most trained for, which was kind of the technical and the content oriented side. And so, people coming out of these programs are actually getting a lot of sort of basic, I'd call it environmental literacy. And then they're getting some good hard skills. There's always more that can be done, but whatever it is, whether it's like GIS or it's like life cycle assessment or it's, technical training in whatever particular area.
Carbon inventories or frameworks for reporting and things like that are big in the consulting world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And at the University of Michigan, we have the ERD program, which is this joint degree program between our business school and our environmental school. And those are the types of skills that people need. But what they're not getting is actual training in how to work together, how to communicate well, and how to be effective managers of these problems.
I have a question that I think you might be well suited to answer being in the education world. And it's that throughout the podcast and these conversations, I've heard a lot of kind of broad skills, like we need communication skills or we need public speaking skills or collaboration skills. And I think that's really important to highlight those major categories. But I feel like oftentimes I imagine listeners, they hear those buzzwords kind of often and say, okay, that's great, but like, how do I really develop those skills or what does that actually look like? Could you try to really like focus in and describe what do you see students needing to actually work on, or how do you recommend they, get those skills that can be kind of broad or maybe hard to define in the sustainability context?
Yeah, I guess I'd start with the context for our field. And I think this, again, applies across sectors, whether you're in the consulting world or whether you're in the nonprofit world or in government, is that we're dealing with wicked problems, right? So these problems that it's hard to even define what the problem is, let alone the solution set. And you've got interrelated social, environmental, and economic things happening. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a major issue that we're collectively working on that doesn't have that. Or sometimes in the language, I'm sure this podcast, you hear it as kind of that VUCA leadership, right? So it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Mm-hmm. So you start with that and you say, well, that means that we need a skill set that's really dialed in on sort of the communication side of things, on the collaboration and teamwork. And so your question of how do you actually get to that, right? How does that actually work? Well, there's a lot of ways, but what we have found is that you have to have these experiences that are experiential, that where you've got project-based learning, where you've got peer-to-peer learning going on, and where faculty and others are taking the role of not traditional teacher, but as mentor and coach. So you need good coaching. And the wonderful thing about time in academia and in these sustainability leadership training programs is that it should be, and some programs are very good at this, others have a ways to go, but it should be a time for reflective learning, right? So like, it's not just doing the projects, it's actually having the time and space to start taking away, what are the key lessons for you? What are the skill sets and competencies that I'm building, that you as a person are building, and where are the deficiencies? And that can really only, you can do assessments and things like that. And I think that's important, but it really only comes out through the context of these multifaceted projects where you've got guidance and you've got that reflective space. And to me, that's the bottom line of where we need to be heading with these sustainability leadership training programs. And I think higher education has a critical role. I tell my students this all the time. You don't really get those opportunities when you're out in the professional world or at least they're rare. Here, I'm sitting here in my office in an academic building. Here, that is our job, right? So that is the primary role, is to actually be reflective and to do that training. And so I talk to my students about taking advantage of that, but you actually have to give them projects. You have to give them things that they can sink their teeth into. And for me, and I come, I'm an academic now, but most of my career has been in the nonprofit sector. And I've had some time in the private sector and public sector. That's what I bring to bear. And so I'm not as interested in the theoretical parts of this. Some of my colleagues are really good at that. That's not my particular interest. It's actually developing those skill sets and doing that coaching and creating that reflective space.
That sounds so valuable for your students. That's awesome.
I mean, I hope so.
Yeah.
I guess maybe it'd be best to give just an example of this, because I think, we can keep talking this higher level, but one of the things that I spend much of my time with, and a lot of programs have some variants of this, but I teach largely at the master's level. I have some undergrads, but mostly I'm teaching master's students right now. And they do a 3-semester long, or it's really 16 months long project with a client. So I line up clients and projects, and then they're on teams of 3 to 6 people over this period. And it's actually, it's more akin to an environmental consulting project. It's got some academic lens to it, meaning they're collecting primary data and things like that, but really they're consultants for whoever it is. And sometimes it's public sector, sometimes it's private sector, NGOs, et cetera. Like I try and get a diverse range of clients. And so they go and do these projects, and they start out with sort of me leading it and them sort of taking part in it. And by the end, they're leading it. And then they have all this built-in reflective space, right? So I require them to do things that actually, frankly, sometimes annoy them in the beginning, things like team charters and like checking in on how it's going process-wise, doing skills assessments before and after. And invariably they start by going, oh, for God's sakes, would you just let us do the project already? And then in the end, they're like, oh, wait, that built-in reflection and the requirement to stop, take a deep breath and not just do what we're doing, but analyze it from a personal and professional perspective. That's where the learning actually occurs beyond the content knowledge, or in addition to the content knowledge. And so I happen to do those on Great Lakes water-oriented projects, because that's my primary area of focus, along with the sustainability leadership. But of course, that could be applied to any issue or any particular area or field. So those are the types of things that we have found to be really, really effective in building these competencies.
Those projects sound amazing. And the fact that you're modeling them kind of around consulting, I think is really cool too, because a lot of people say, and this has definitely been my experience, that, jumping into a consulting role can help you just get a lot of experience quickly with many different companies. The client service side of things really helps you communicate and build just kind of basic consistency and diligence and everything. So those types of projects sound like, if you can get them in your education program instead of going into a consulting role, sounds hugely valuable.
Exactly. So hopefully they go in with not only some experience, and frankly, it can help them get these jobs in the first place, right? Because they demonstrate that not only the content knowledge, but the process knowledge, the soft skills, or however we want it. So it helps with that. And then I hope it helps when they're actually in these consulting roles, which can often be, as you well know, really intensive time-wise. They've actually built in their own processes for reflection, for improvement, for all those things. And when we talk to leaders in the field, and when we do the surveys, one of the things they say is our best employees, the best people who move ahead in the company or organization, whatever it is, are very self-reflective. Like they're able to learn from their experiences in different ways. And that takes some muscle memory to do that. Establishing those skills within higher education, I think that's a key thing that we here sort of in the ivory tower have to do, and we have to do better. But then it translates to people actually getting ahead in their careers, however they want to define getting ahead, but being self-reflective.
Yeah, and what you're describing in terms of the project-based learning is definitely reflected in the first episode of this season that we did with Neil Yo, who runs a 1.5 Academy, which is like a private training academy. And he was talking about how, he sees students from university programs come in with a really great theoretical knowledge, but just applying the skills and doing project-based learning really helps them lock in those theoretical skills and also build the more practical competencies.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm not familiar directly with his work, but that directly aligns with what our long-term findings have been. And, when you ask people in the field too, like what's interesting is how they rank technical or content knowledge varies based on how long they've been in the field. And maybe this won't surprise you given all these amazing conversations that you've had, but like people who are just out of these programs actually rank technical and content knowledge really high as they go on in their careers, right? So we surveyed people everywhere from one year out to, I think our oldest have been out for like 40 years. And they, in general, put technical and content knowledge way lower. And the skills that they're looking for are teamwork, collaboration, project management. They put all those things up high. And I think it's in part because when you're newer to the field, when you're younger, you're really excited about what you know. You have to have that baseline knowledge. I don't want that to be misinterpreted. If you don't have like those basic, let's call them hard skills, you're not going to get to. And so, I'm talking about the other side of those skills because they're ignored, but not because the hard skills aren't important. But it's just if you only have that, you get capped out in your career pretty early, or you have to go back and learn those things. And people who are more advanced in their careers see that really, really clearly.
So you're saying you survey folks about what is most important in their role or most important in who they're hiring for? Could you describe that a little bit more?
Actually, but it's a great question because we ask both those things. So we start by asking them about their own role. And then we say, when you look back, what do you think it takes, to succeed in this? And we actually put it in their organization because it's a little hard for people to say like the field because our field's so diverse. But when they look back at their career path and the organization that they work with, what did they see as the measures for success versus what they personally were trained on? So we surveyed graduates of sustainability leadership programs at multiple universities. And we didn't limit it by time of graduation. They had to be currently employed and they had to be alumni of these programs. That was really the criteria. And then we asked them to be sort of reflective of their own careers and then what they saw for others. So we did.
Interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like the responses there move from prioritizing the technical skills early in the career to the more communication and leadership skills further in the career. And I think that probably reflects the journey of a professional as well in terms of the beginning of the career. They're really a doer and they're assigned these tasks to use those hard skills. Whereas as they progress in their career, they become more of a leader, having to lead people, communicate strategies, build strategies, and really just set the vision as opposed to do the work. I mean, unless a company has like 2 sustainability people, which is usually the case, and then they're kind of jack of all trades. But
no, I think that's absolutely right, and 100% what we've seen from these pieces. One other thing I wanted to mention that I found interesting in this survey, and we're just writing up the results of this now, is that we asked about a series of equity and justice related competencies. Because what I'm seeing is a big push for those competencies to be emphasized. I know the Trump era is, from the national politics standpoint, trying to move us away from that, but that's not what we're seing with our students and others. They're asking for these competencies.
That's good.
So we thought we would survey and ask people in the field. I was very surprised. These competencies came out on the bottom of what people thought. In terms of needing them for success. Now, there's a couple of interpretations. One of them is it's actually really hard to ask these in surveys. They're really complex. I mean, this is all complex, but like we're not sure if we have a measurement error here, which very well could be because there's just not the scales to measure this like there are in things like communication. And, if you ask people about communication skills, they know what you need. If you just say what are your skills in equity and justice, they don't. So we're trying to. So that could be one. Another explanation, and we were asking like the difference between the training and the needs in the field. The other explanation could be like the training is actually there right now for what the needs in the field are. The people are getting trained in this. But on our scale, we asked about 10 different competencies. The 3 related to equity and justice came out consistently on the bottom, which I would not have predicted. And then we asked follow-ups, and people said that they were important and that their companies were emphasizing it, but that they felt like they had the right level of skill. So it might be simply that academia does have that right now. And so it doesn't jump up on our scale when we're asking where there's differentials. So I just thought that'd be an interesting finding because it was counterintuitive to me, at least. If I predicting ahead of time, I wouldn't have predicted we'd see those at the bottom of the scale.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I wonder if it also has to do with the fact that it's kind of harder to categorize or define equity and justice components of sustainability. I usually find that the environmental side of things is very, you can just really point to a lot of specific topics like climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, water use, all that kind of stuff. But then it's harder to categorize some of the more governance and social side of things.
Absolutely. And we asked about things like, how much does lived experience factor in, which is often used as a proxy for equity and justice. And again, we may have had a measurement problem because people rank that really low, but what our respondents might have thought and meant for that versus what we had hoped might have been different. And the other things on the scale, we were using some established scales that have come through the field, some of the standard one on sustainability skills, but those don't exist in our field for equity and justice competencies.
So you mentioned that one of the challenges with academia preparing students for the job market is just the, bringing people in from the industry that can really act as a mentor and closing that gap between like the people that work in academia and connecting them to the business world and like what's actually happening in the job market. Do you have any thoughts on how we could transform every university? Like, let's say every university had a great sustainability program. What would that take and what would that look like?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is you have to have some structured experiential part to it. And that does mean bringing in people from the business world and elsewhere. But the thing is, you can't just sort of say, hey, company X, we have students, would you like to do something with them? Right? Like, so that generally doesn't work because, the needs of students and the skill set of students aren't going to line up well with a company unless you have some structured interaction over time, and where the expectations on the part of the organization that's sponsoring it and the students and the faculty mentor are really clear. So the projects that I was explaining earlier, we really spend a whole semester with scoping and expectations and background. And it takes that much time, and I think, and we talk about an ideal program, you have to put in that time up front. And the relationships also develop over time. Many of my projects are with people that I've known for a long time, and I could sort of have conversations with and who are invested in the mentorship of students as well as the project itself. I mean, it's got to be both. We always say that we're learning with our clients on all of these projects. But we're not learning at the expense of our clients. Like, so it's got to be like, and I mean that as a physical, as like a fiscal expense and sort of a, social emotional expense too. Like, but it's got to have that collaborative structure. So that's the thing about that is it takes time and effort and a skill set. And so ideal programs, almost every program says they have an experiential component. But that often means we have a class that is in the field, and that could just mean like a field biology class or something like that. And that's fine, but that's generally not the type of competencies that I'm talking about here. So you've got to have that. It's got to be sustained over the long term, and it's got to have that sort of, it's got to have academia, and it's got to have those outside academia. I was going to say those in the real world. As someone inside academia, I have a pet peeve. We're in the real world.
Yes. Yep.
Because I'm like, this is actually a real world too. But that's my own sort of thing on that.
Absolutely. One of the big challenges is that sustainability is changing quickly, regardless of where you're talking about. So it's not just aligning the challenge of aligning the businesses with the goals of your students is a big one. And the fact that sustainability is changing not only for academia and for the students, but for the businesses monthly sometimes. It's just a moving target, right? Like it's hard to design a course and then also bring the business in while they're also trying to figure out sustainability for their company to then teach it. Is just constantly evolving.
Exactly. And that's where the technical content and content knowledge is necessary but not sufficient, right? Because if we look back, and we didn't actually do this, but I would suspect if we look back at, the content knowledge that, say, my program provided for our people 20 years ago, and actually I do know that because I went through this program 20 years ago. It's where I did my master's and PhD. Like, that's not the skill set that matters right now, right? Because things were so different, and our field is particularly dynamic on that. A lot of my writing is about sort of sustainability leadership as modern leadership. And what I mean by that is our field is one of constant change, constant innovation, constant uncertainty. And that is a defining feature of leadership overall right now. Our field's just kind of been on the cutting edge of that based on who we are. A field like, I don't know, banking or something like that. I don't know, I pick on banking, but it's probably been pretty similar for a lot of years, although it's going through massive transitions now because of AI and all those kinds of. Our field has had that since the beginning, and we're a young field, relatively speaking, the leadership aspects of it are very under-researched. But when we talk about the dynamic nature of it, that to be a sustainability leader, it's really, really something that we need in leadership in all areas, even outside sustainability.
Yeah, and you have to be comfortable with that constant change and uncertainty as well, right?
Yeah, and yes, comfortable with it. And actually, I think you kind of have to thrive in that, right? Like, because if you're not thriving in that sort of dynamic environment, I think it's really hard to play a critical role in our field. And I think it's really hard to be a leader in any field right now.
True. Yeah, you need to be able to be comfortable with the fact that you can't just be pointed to instructions to do something.
Yeah,
Like
there is.
that you kind of have to figure a lot of things out as you go, regardless of if you're an entry-level employee or a seasoned leader. There's no instruction manual for this stuff.
Exactly. And that's where that process knowledge really comes in, right? Because if you're a good communicator, if you're good at working with teams, if you're a good collaborator, those types of things translate regardless of what you're going through. Whereas the specific knowledge about how you, constructed the map or did something else, that's going to change greatly over time. And of course, it can be picked up on the job. I've hired, many, many people over my career, particularly in the nonprofit sector. And I was always looking for who demonstrated that they could work on something complex and accomplish concrete goals, and who could actually show they can work with a diverse group of people and get high quality outcomes from that. I always figured I could teach them the content knowledge pretty quickly. I was working largely in water policy and climate policy. It's like, I can give them a couple weeks and the right resources, and somebody who's smart and motivated enough, they'll pick up those pieces. I can do that. I can't effectively, at least not right away, train people on that sort of process knowledge. And some people are just sort of like have more natural affinity for that. So I always talked about it. It's kind of like the analog of hiring for talent. I was hiring for sort of like that process and those soft skills always. And that served me very well in the nonprofit world, which, I think is one of the more dynamic parts of our field.
Yeah. How do you look for those things? Because it's easy to demonstrate on a resume that you've got this certification or you've done a project demonstrating this hard skill. But I'm sure it's less intuitive for people to understand how they can go into an interview and demonstrate the fact that they have worked with a diverse group of people and done that well.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, what I would do on the other side of the interviewing is I would give people scenarios a lot. I would give them different scenarios that were like what they would deal with in their work. So maybe it was trying to design a campaign plan, or maybe, I did a lot of political work. Senator X, Y, and Z wants this particular information and wants to know how to vote on this. What would your approach be? And my questions were almost always like, how would you approach this problem? Not how would you solve it, because that's not reasonable to ask an interviewee. But and then what I would look for is, can they sort of show, not just tell, right? So not just say, I would do X, Y, and Z, or not just kind of stay at the principle level, but give really practical examples of what they have done in a similar situation, and could they take away sort of that knowledge? And what I always tell my advisees, because they tend to be newer to the field, they're a little bit age diverse, but these tend to be younger people to the field, is no one's going to expect you to have 20 years experience if you're just out of college or just out of grad school. And you're not probably going to have the direct experience in the professional world people want to show how you think through problems and that you have concrete ways of doing that. And that can be if you're an undergrad, what club were you a part of? And what did you do outside? What was your volunteer work? Even a class project or something like that. It doesn't have to be an analog in the professional world, but what have you done that has a similar thought process? And were you reflective about that? Were you effective? And also I was, as soon as to show a little humility, if something didn't go well, I actually think it's a great strategy in an interview to talk about, like, I tried this thing and it totally failed. Here's why. And here's what I learned from it. And here's what I would do next time. So demonstrating, like in our field, if somebody tells you they really know what they're doing and where it's going to go in 20 years, run away because they have no idea. So demonstrating that humility right way.
Absolutely. And I imagine that when responding to those scenario-based questions as well, it's helpful to really speak through your thought process aloud. And I imagine that you'd be looking for somebody to not just say, okay, well, practically I would set up this program or do something like that, but maybe them identifying what challenges they might run into, like, oh, I would want to bring in people from across the business and different departments to understand their challenges. And then I'd want to summarize those challenges and the thought process of kind of getting to a solution that works for everyone as opposed to just, implementing something.
Exactly. And I know as an employer that is 100% what I was looking for. Because again, you can train those other parts of things, but like how people think through problems and how they deal with the dynamic nature of our field it's really critical. And going back to the best sustainability leadership training programs really help their students with these problems in multiple ways.
Yeah. You mentioned a moment ago about how sustainability leadership is modern leadership. And I love that quote, but how would you describe, if there is the difference between a sustainability leader today and a more traditional leader? What has sustainability injected into leadership over the last decade?
Yeah, I think it's injected this maybe the obvious, managing for the triple bottom line, right? So like when we think about that, sustainability leadership or ESG or however, it's been defined, corporate social responsibility, it's gone through these multiple iterations over time. But that managing for multiple objectives at once, I think that has permeated leadership, and it's come from not just from our field, but a lot from our field. And then I think like putting sort of the ethics and morality issues right there with all the other issues up front. When you're dealing with sustainability challenges, you're trying to think about the next generation or the seventh generation or all those kinds of things, that long-term thinking, that's another premise that comes from sustainability leadership, not exclusively, but extensively, that has kind of permeated. It's really interesting, like modern leadership, or if we talk about traditional leadership, kind of comes from like scientific management and command and control on the factory floor and all these things, and kind of the great man theory. And I use that gender term intentionally because that is where traditional leadership theory has come. It's evolved a bit, but that's still kind of the place where it's at. Whereas sustainability leadership really arose from sort of the grassroots advocacy of the 60s and 70s and indigenous activists and all these different pieces as sort of this collaborative. I tend to think of it as evolved more like the analogy is like an ecosystem, right? In this sort of like chaotic, when you look at it from distance, but this synergistic, diverse way from the ground up. And so those different points have arisen separately, and sustainability leadership, I think, can be a bridge between those. So I'm really interested in what sustainability can tell us about leadership overall and how that can help us across all sectors, not just in our field. That's what a lot of my writing has been about.
That's so helpful. And it definitely resonates with me in terms of how sustainability changes the way a business operates. Like, what are those core components? And I'd love to test a little theory with you. It's that I feel like the way I've tried to describe sustainability to some leaders is just long-term strategy, like thinking longer, thinking with a longer time horizon, because you can talk about integrating specific topics into leadership, like environmental impacts or social responsibility and things like that. But ultimately, I think it really comes down to like shifting the perspective from what are the impacts this next quarter versus what's going to happen in 5 years or 10 years maybe, and how's that going to affect the business? Do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
I totally agree with that. It's long term. I would maybe add to that with multiple objectives too.
Okay.
Sort of triple bottom line part, which I think is really ingrained and embedded in probably even the folks talk to, but I still don't think has permeated out into the business world as deeply as it should. And in fact, in the current in the U.S. side, we might be taking sort of back steps on that right now.
Yeah,
But the long term,
definitely. Which is,
but your definition, thinking long term, I totally agree with that. I think that's crucial.
yeah. Well, really helpful to understand what a sustainability leader is compared to a traditional leader. So we've talked a lot about how we are training sustainability leaders and what students might do to really optimize and gain those skills needed for employment. You might just summarize some of what we've talked about, but do you have any other recommendations for college students who have recently completed their degrees and are out there looking for jobs?
Yeah, I mean, to summarize a bit, it's the skills and relationships. It's like when you're
Okay.
out there competing for that, like how can you demonstrate that you can manage a project, demonstrate that you can work with people, demonstrate that you can communicate well. And again, it doesn't have to be in the professional world. This could be in clubs. This could be activity. Sports are actually a great way to demonstrate this in different ways. And so I sometimes think that students will go into this saying, I need to have the very specific knowledge that these whatever it is this job is looking for, and they forget about the skills and the relationship side. In fact, you need to demonstrate that, and you want people who are looking for that in other employees, right? So like if you're not actually asked those types of things, I'd actually be skeptical that this is the place that you want to work, because if they're not thinking about that, I think it can be a problem. So you're also evaluating the interviewers, and so I kind of prep my students with that. And again, I go back to like show, don't just tell, right? So like the interviews that stay at a very high or theoretical level or sort of principle level and don't give really specific guidance or really specific examples, I think don't do nearly as well in interviews and in cover letters, all the pieces of the job application process.
Yeah. And if you think that they're not asked those questions, do you think it might be relevant to try to bring up some of those topics? To say, hey, let me tell you about a time when I did this, or I want to describe. I mean, usually an interviewer will say something along the lines of, is there anything else you want to share with us? And maybe that's an opportunity to tell a story or just try to really demonstrate the softer skills that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. And maybe even ask that question like, what does it take for people to really advance in this world, in this job? And it'd be interesting to see. I think that is likely to get to the soft skills, right? I mean, if it's the results of the survey that I did show that, but it's also just sort of logical, and that might lead into that conversation. I encourage students to ask those types of questions. It shows ambition, but it also gives a little insight into like, I don't know, when it comes to a performance review or when it comes to like who makes it to the next level, all those kinds of things. What are they actually looking for? And my guess is they're going to bring out those, communication, collaboration, project management, all those kinds of things will probably be put on the table right then.
Amazing. I'd love to shift the focus a little bit to you and your journey just to understand more about how that shaped where you are today. So could you describe a little bit about the lessons you learned early in your career that still inform the way you teach and the way you work?
Sure. In my career, I've had parts in the nonprofit sector, a few different nonprofits. I spent the last 8 years before I came to the University of Michigan about 2 years ago with the National Wildlife Federation running the Great Lakes region. And, that was a very interesting job because there was education, there was policy advocacy, there was lobbying, there was a little bit of everything. And to me, the most important thing I think I learned early in my career, I worked at Environment America, a nonprofit, and did a lot of congressional advocacy. Is really the relationships part of it, right? So I've spent a decent amount of time of my time in Congress and in the state legislature advocating for environmental policy. And it gets back to what we we're talking about before. You have to know your stuff. I mean, if I'm going into those meetings and I don't know, I was lobbying on the renewable energy standard, for example, I better know the basics of how that works. I better know all those different pieces. But I also need to know, what are the dynamics behind this? What's holding it back? That was always my question early on. Environmental policy, it almost seems like common sense, and people generally support it when they know what it is, whether it's, clean water,
especially if you support that. Like you think, oh, this is common sense, but then there must be other perspectives that you're not aware of or just don't resonate with you that are holding this back, right?
Exactly. So that question of why hasn't this happened yet? And
Yeah.
I tried to and I think you can apply that, not just in sort of this lobbying context, but across the board. What is holding this back? What are the barriers? And then trying to figure out the opportunities that can come from that, the ways to work around that. So I learned that, I think, fairly early in my career. And it's something that I carry with me. And it really applies to, I'm asking my students that all the time, so what's stopping you? Why do you think this isn't happening? Or the students that are working with the clients, why did they bring you in to solve this or to work on this? If they could have just done it, they wouldn't have asked for a project like this. They wouldn't have asked for a team to work on this and to dig deep. Why might that be? What are the barriers? So kind of keep asking those types of questions, which I started early in my career and I still do now.
Really like that perspective, because I think it can be easy to just focus on the reason why to do something, especially when it comes to sustainability topics, like just trying to force an environmental project down a business's throat with this are the environmental benefits, and saying, we should just do it because it's the right thing to do. And there's benefit X, Y, Z, but not addressing the reasons why it hasn't been done already. I think probably is oftentimes a reason why it just comes, the communication isn't there. Like the message doesn't land, because maybe they do care about the environmental stuff, but there's some big barrier to investment, or there's some big stakeholder who doesn't want to get it done, and not addressing that just doesn't let the message land, I imagine.
Yeah. And I think in this field, we're so sure that we're on the right side of things, to sort of put right in air quotes there, because it's not only the right thing to do, but it's profitable and all these kinds of things. And I believe all that on almost everything that we work on. I would say I've never worked on a policy that I didn't believe strongly in. But that's not enough to get it done. If it was, it would already be done, right? So surfacing like those barriers, and then seeing them not as sort of insurmountable obstacles, but seeing them as opportunities, ways to work around. So I'll give an example right now. I mean, we've got, not to be political, but the Trump administration is taking down a lot of our federal environmental policy. So I don't think that's a controversial statement. That's a statement of fact. And that there's real harm being done from that. And I don't want to sugarcoat that. It is also an opportunity to rethink our federal environmental system, right? Which has evolved for problems of the past, evolved mainly in the early 70s, responsive to the problems of the 50s, 60s, et cetera, and actually isn't very responsive to the problems of the present and the future, things like climate change, chemicals of emerging concern, all these things, even non-point source pollution in the water world that I work in, wasn't the issue back then. And so in that chaos and destruction that's happening right now, how do we envision the future that we want for our federal environmental protection system? And how do we use that as an opportunity moving forward when times are better for that, right? And you have to so there were barriers to that happening in the past, things like, if we just stick with the Clean Water Act, right? There's people were worried about opening that up to the changes that were needed to actually protect our waterways, figuring bad things could happen. Well, I got to tell you, bad things are happening in the Clean Water Act right now. Like that is happening. It's not being enforced. There's all these kinds of things. So let's use that as an opportunity to push for what we actually want and what we should be happening, and looking at what were those barriers before might actually be breaking down, maybe not in the way we wanted. And so I've been sort of on this push for us to be future oriented, vision oriented, and be ready for opportunities that come up when times are better at the federal level. So just to use that as one example.
Like that example. And it highlights the opportunity to create new solutions that address the challenges. It makes me think of another example from the business world with packaging, let's say. So it's like if more sustainable packaging isn't profitable, like it doesn't cost less than the virgin plastic packaging, let's say, then that oftentimes is, a big woe. And a sustainability professional might say, wow, that's just, I wish we could do it, but we can't because it's not profitable. But that's just an opportunity to create and improve sustainable packaging, compostable packaging systems, and create something that works for the business and works for the environment. And then we have a bang up solution on our hands, and it's a no-brainer, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. I'm thinking about sort of, how do you create value so that not only when the time's right, but when you think about, all those barriers is different as things shift. And maybe right now, because costs are going up so much, maybe some of those solutions actually come into play now on more sustainable packaging. I'm not familiar exactly with that industry, but those are the types of opportunities I think are important to think about.
Yeah. So when you worked in NGO, throughout your career, how have the different roles that you've had shaped the way you approach sustainability work and the way you view sustainability leadership now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in roles like I was shaped early on by a really grassroots role. So I was doing, door-to-door campaigning and overseeing some of that work. And the thing that shaped me early on was, while my concern level about environmental issues, is way up here. I guess gesturing probably isn't helpful for a podcast, but it's high.
Yeah.
And the most people that we talk to, this sounds cliche, but in their day-to-day lives, it's not a matter of focus, right? I mean, everyone's got, and that's true for me for many other issues that I might care about at some level, but they're not a piece of focus. So, it was shaped to me early on that if we are in these roles, whether we're looking at our customers, whether we're looking at our clients, whether we're looking at our members of a nonprofit, we have to understand that their prioritizations of the issues that might be core to what we think about, 24 hours a day is just different. And so that approach has to change. So I got that early in my career, particularly in some of the more grassroots work. That carries through to how now I'm more sort of doing the teaching and designing strategies and working at that sort of that strategic level. But you have to keep that lesson throughout. And a lot of that is about the sort of communication side of things, right? If we're not communicating how this has direct impacts and making things easy for people to do, again, whether it's customers and others, like if you put the better environmental choice aligned with something else, and it's just as easy, people are going to gravitate towards the environmental. So that was something that I learned early on through, a lot of conversations, kind of one-on-one, and the plus conversations in the legislature and other things too, that's carried through in my work and in the training that we try and do here.
It reminds me of a mental hack that I follow sometimes that is basically asking yourself the question, what would this look like if it was easy? And basically just if you come into a challenge, or if you're working on something that's complicated, you just say, what would it look like if this was effortless? And what's standing in the way of me getting to that point?
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Like, where's the easy button? I think some companies call that as a commercial, right? They've got the easy button.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
what would that look like for this product?
How do we create the easy button? What are the barriers that are stopping me from doing this? How do we clear those so that this is just the no-brainer path? Right.
Yeah. I think that's a great way of looking at it. Absolutely.
It's helpful to understand how your time in the grassroots NGO space helped you understand how to communicate and simplify things for people in the sustainability space. Is that something you teach to students and really focus on?
Try to, yeah. I mean, if you've got, you got 1 minute to make your case with somebody, absolutely. I remember one of my first jobs in Environment America, we were doing trainings, and the training was basically, and this wasn't the door-to-door, this was more the lobbying part. You got 1 minute to convince Senator X to vote for this bill. They're walking to the floor. And we practiced like walking with them, and making your case in that time. Now, hopefully you've got more than that, but you can also, actually, I was thinking of a more recent example where I was with students at a conference, and the university president was also at this conference. And when we were driving from the airport to the conference hotel, and the students were trying to get the president to do this sustainability action, I said, if you get your time with the president, let's practice what you would say. What's your elevator pitch? And okay, who actually gets in the elevator with us? The president of the university. I mean, I've never had that happen before. We practiced the elevator pitch, and the president was in their casual clothes, like kind of they were going to their hotel room for the night.
They must have looked at you like, you set this up, didn't you?
If I was that good, I would have. But and I'm nudging them, and sure enough, they make their pitch. And they did it just enough. Like the poor person was just trying to get back to their whatever. And then when the president gave their big speech at this conference, what did they reference? The conversation they had in the elevator, and made that commitment that next day. And so those kinds of things, I think, can be really, really effective and powerful.
That's amazing. I love that story. It's a good example of being ready, of remaining ready to strike when opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, because I think if we hadn't practiced that, they probably would have been just sort of tongue-tied or whatever, like, I don't know, if you're not prepared for that situation, then you're not going to be ready. But those quick communications are so critical.
Really. So as we wrap up here, I'd love a quick closing reflection on this question. Is there a leadership trait or recommendation that you see celebrated that actually might get in the way of sustainability progress?
Yeah, I love that question. And, I teach this, or I have this online sustainability leadership development course where I interview a bunch of different leaders, similar to what you're doing on this podcast. In fact, I think, so I mentioned before we started, I require them to watch one of these podcasts based on their interest. And what I found for the leaders that I talked to, and it's my experience too, is that the thing that seems, I don't know, overrated, whatever, it's confidence and public speaking. It's those most visible of leadership traits. And I actually think some of those things, particularly the confidence side, can be really overrated in our field, right? So like the leaders that are sort of like traditional leader followers, when you're talking about the sustainability leadership, they're gonna lead you off a cliff somewhere, because if people say that they've got confidence in where we're headed and know all the science and know all the data, know all search, I just wouldn't believe it, because nobody does. And even that, and I think the public speaking, while it's an important thing to be able to do, and I don't mean that, but like often that is equated with strong leadership, those who can get up and command a room. Right. And that, of course, is one form that's an important form. But, I'm a big proponent of situational leadership and leadership from the position you're in. And often it's those people that are moving behind the scenes. It's those people that are kind of the glue people in teams. That's the kind of leadership skill that really matters and can be underappreciated, as opposed to those who are very smooth in big public forums. So those would be the two that I would highlight.
Definitely. You mentioned humility earlier, and that sounds like the counterbalance to overconfidence. And then also the ability to bring people together to accomplish a goal sounds kind of like the counterbalance to that just public speaking-esque, this is just the way it is, and this is the way we're going to go, and then leading everyone off a cliff potentially.
Yeah, I think that is that bringing people together around the complex goal with a common vision and purpose, that is the sustainability leadership superpower. That's the thing that you need. And that doesn't always mean that you're the most confident person and you're the one in front of the rest.
Well, I'm sure that's pretty comforting for people who might feel like there's a large gap between them and, being that super charismatic public speaker who can easily command the room. I mean, you don't have to be that to be impactful in a sustainability role.
Absolutely. And I would say it might be the hardest thing I have to get across to my students. It's the most difficult thing to convey, because we're just all steeped in that traditional sort of leadership mantra, whether we know it or not. It's just steeped in our culture and all those other things. So I have to spend a lot of time trying to deconstruct that, and it's hard. It's hard to grasp.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Mike. I'm sure that everyone listening has really enjoyed getting a behind the scenes look at how sustainability leadership, how your sustainability leadership program operates and why you run it the way you do. But it sounds really interesting. I wish every university had something like that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for the work that you're doing on this podcast. As I said, I've long listened to it, and I'm happy to be a part of it today. And thanks for the really insightful questions.
Keep up the good work, Mike. Thanks so much.
You too.